Jet Set Radio, Street Fighter, Fortnite. What do all these games have in common? Well, depending on who you ask, there's always going to be someone out there who calls these dead games. It's a hot topic of the modern day as games go from products to live services, but most claims that a game has its foot in the grave is normally centered around scaremongering, clickbaiting, and fiction. What's a lot rarer than popularity scaremongering is the elusive dead genre. It's not common to see a whole subset of a medium disappear into the aether of obscurity, the way that skateboarding games did. At the turn of the century, you basically couldn't escape skateboarding video games. Everywhere you turn, you'd find Tony Hawk's face or one of the many games inspired by the Pro Skater franchise. But today, you'd be lucky to catch wind of a title in the genre, even brainstorming development. Unlike the arena shooter that would go on to inspire the modern first-person shooter the way we know it, skating games failed to inspire more games like them and would eventually fizzle out of demand. Nobody's rocking up to E3 eagerly awaiting the next aggressive inline. Except for me. What we have today is a list of titles that were once explosive in their popularity, but now can't even muster the energy to even attempt at scratching its former success. So today I want to take a little wander down memory lane. Not only past the extremely influential games that everyone loves and remembers, but also towards the rejects that we can point and laugh at, and hopefully find out where it all went wrong. Does that sound good to you? I hope it does, because that's what we're doing. Video start now. Skateboarding in the 1980s was very different from how we view it today. Stemming from the origins of surfers looking for something to do whilst waves weren't in ideal conditions, skating as a concept wasn't as defined in its identity. It was a sub-activity, made to replace another activity with similar goals that left it inebriated and scattered in what it wanted to be. That stumbling confusion being reflected in the first skateboarding video game 720. Was it limited? Certainly. Arcade hardware can't help the fact this game was made in the Middle Ages after all, but it's trying its hardest to keep the bare bones gameplay of momentum, movement, and ollies varied to the best of its ability. The slalom and downhill sections are trying to recontextualize movement to be about precision and speed respectively, with jumps and ramps doing the same for spinning, with a main street area acting as both a traversal space between objectives and a place to learn the mechanics, as you use them to earn gold medals in the 4 main challenges. Alright, that's all of the mechanics out of the way, let's check the rest of my notes for this game, and oh wow, would you look at that. Don't get me wrong, 720 is fine, but mediocrity isn't exactly a strong basis for a whole genre. The problem isn't what's missing. From our future perspective, we might see the kickflip-shaped hole in its trick system and wonder when they're going to finally start playing Goldfinger's Superman. But the real problem here is that 720 never settles on a focus. Is this a game about speed, or is this a game about tricks? It's a game about both. But the way the challenges are laid out means that these elements never interact with one another. Slopes and ramps altered your speed and jump height, potentially creating a compelling player-environment relationship, but all of the movement challenges are set on flat plains or pure hills, meaning that you never need to consider the environment around you. Tricks are more a question of how fast you can spin a stick rather than considering how long a process takes. So jump heights and tricks never directly engaged with one another. It was the game equivalent of ordering a pizza, but each of the toppings are separated across different slices. Really, you want each element to layer together and create a compelling flavor, but for the longest time, the skating pizzeria just kind of tasted like balls. This was a problem that plagued the incredibly small handful of games released within this era. Further emphasized by Skate or Die, which would release a year later, continuing to drink drive its way into mediocrity. It's closer to WarioWare than the act of actually skating. Disconnected ideas of racing, combat, and more spinning, never intertwining to make for a game with surprising depth, but never changing frequently enough to be an oddly entertaining mix of minigames. The few other skateboarding games are more accurately games with skateboarding set dressing. Skateboarding is a digital Where's Waldo, but with gradient tubes and Pokemon Mystery Dungeon stairs. Skate Rock is garbage. Radical Rex is a mascot platformer that I played for 30 minutes because the wiki category described it as a skateboarding video game, but I think it would be more accurate to say it was a waste of my fucking time! But for all their flaws, the earliest skateboarding games don't go without any value. Definitely not as games, but as portals to the culture of skateboarding in the years that these games were released. The absence of any flip tricks or rails that we would consider standard today is a reflection of the state of the activity at the time. Commonly, commercial decks weren't the oblongs that we're used to today. Instead, they were wider, with shallower noses to accommodate the prominent styles of skating at the time. These decks might not have been ideal for the freestyle nature of street skating that would eventually rise to prominence, but the commercial companies' advertising boards had vert ramps to show off their gear in a more flashy, extravagant manner. The advertised ideals of skateboarding were presented through vert ramps and bowls, which led to daydreams of performing well at their few tournaments focusing on grabs and spins. But the average American, skating on a daily basis, would be more familiar with the high-speed traversal that had itself garnered popularity. This is reflected in the games of the time. The reason that tasks are so separated in games is because skating with or without a vert ramp were, and to some extent still are, distinctly different activities. Tricking and traversal weren't literally separated ideas at the time, but they were more isolated than today, and that got reflected in the games that were literally about skateboarding. These games created challenges around the activity it was based off of, and while that isn't an excuse for the underwhelming gameplay that was created, it's the reasoning that the games were presented the way that they were. You could also catch glimpses of the punk rock aesthetic that skating would find itself synonymous with, though admittedly through the lens of an Atari 2600 or a NES, it reduces the thematics down to vaguely gesturing towards the misfits and hoping that you get the picture. It wouldn't be until the PlayStation that skateboarding games would successfully catch the board. A point to note is that the PlayStation wasn't just a console that allowed games about skating to stick the landing, it was the console that brought reality to the digital space. Gran Turismo, Madden, WWF SmackDown, the third dimension, PlayStation's third dimension specifically, was when games on the basis of reality not only started to become more realized in their vision, but also considerably more popularized and competitive. This is when FIFA had to compete with Pro Evolution Soccer, and both of them had to compete with Dino Crisis, Fox Sports. But in this generation, the thing that skateboarding games would overcome wasn't a lack of hardware being unable to realize their vision, it was finding a vision in the first place. See, other adaptations of real things didn't seem to have the same issues that we've been dealing with. Games about football didn't have to figure out how to fit soccer into an adventure platforming game. Unless we're talking about like Go-Go Beckham, which, oh wow, look at that potential derail. When you already have a sport, a task with clear goals and rules, the challenge in development becomes refining the laws that go into that process, not how to create a compelling win condition in the first place. Skateboarding, on the other hand, is a concept. There's a reason that I haven't used the word sport to describe it up until this point, because for the most part, it's not. I mean, it can be. There's the SLS and the UK Vert series. We might have contests, but those are scored by judges, and the lack of literal objectives makes that a difficult activity to translate into a digital format. On top of that, a lot of people just don't value competition within the activity. For a lot of people, it's more a task of expression, where the entertainment comes from just enjoying and learning what you're able to make the board do with the environment that's around you. Between the 1980s of 720 and the mid-90s of this era, street skating became significantly more prominent because it was the environment most skaters were expressing themselves in. That's why when ESPN Extreme Games, or 2 Extreme, or 3 Extreme attempted to provide structure in the form of racing, it was extremely fucking aggravating. Skating is a task where I'm satisfied based on how cool the thing I'm doing is, not how I got past a bit of flat land faster than Tim because he met the mean side of a pebble. 1998, Street Skater would come incredibly close to capturing the essence of skateboarding, basing a lot of its gameplay on the arcade release of Top Skater, but would lose the small joy it could have in contextual rigidness. More racing. But it did have the right idea on how to give the player a goal. Players have to reach a point threshold, an open-ended scenario that you're allowed to get to in whatever way you see fit. That goal should inspire some level of player creativity, player expression, the thing that people come to skating for, reflected in a digital environment. But it doesn't. The gameplay and the levels do nothing to complement the goal that the game sets for you. You're being funneled down a hallway and pressing X when the game asks you to. Every trick is the same, they're not connected in any way, and they don't even have any complexity in the movement. You're basically a car that gets a pat on the back every time you go up a ramp, the game condescendingly going, wow, wasn't that cool? I don't want to be told what I'm doing is sick, I want to feel sick! God, it's gonna take another eternity for skateboarding games to get good. Ow, fuck, there's 2 of them? 1999's Tony Hawk's Pro Skater as well as Thrasher Presents Skate and Destroy are two games that found very similar approaches to making skateboarding fun in the digital space. And it's kind of weird how similar they are. Spare a stray demo discs worth of time, these games had no influence on one another, seeing as there was only a month's difference between their release, with Pro Skater being developed by Nethersoft and Thrasher being developed by Z-Axis. Both games wanted to create a core built around expression. These are games where you're always in control, placing you inside of levels that act more like sandboxes for you to connect tricks together as you work towards a goal that can be summed up to impress me. That might seem like every other game up until this point, but that's where you'd be wrong. See, games before now didn't really have player expression, since it never gave you meaningful choices. See, in Street Skater, you approach a rail, and once you've chosen the animation that provides you with the most points, you're then waiting for the next ramp or rail to do the exact same thing over and over again until you reach the end of the level. This is doing basic addition, not playing a game. You're presented with the illusion of options, but a lack of consequences, both negative or positive, means that every choice is functionally identical. This smoke and mirror of choice is something that has plagued the genre right up until these two burned the house down that bad game design was living in. Much like how immersive sims never slap you on the hand or restrict how you solve a problem, Tony and Thrashy give you a bunch of Lego block mechanics and let you put the pieces together however you like, even if that means choking on them. They abstract a bunch of core concepts in skating and turn them into mechanics that, when accessible all of the time, allow for layered, snappy decision making. I'm not supposed to be snapping my fingers. The different types of tricks are all given different properties to supply everything with purpose. Grinds are great for points over a long period of time, but require you to balance yourself out or you eat the pavement. Flips only allow for a set amount of points, but are so quick that you can slot them in almost anywhere. Just make sure that you pick one that's quick enough to land. Grabs are like grinds for the air, but require a massive amount of time to get proper value out of them, and if you're going to go for a grab, you might as well get some spins in, so make sure that you land with your wheels facing the right direction. When the environment lets you juggle between these different elements, you can start to view them as options that lead to greater sequences. Mechanics that literally become greater than the sum of their parts. Rails and ramps become portals to micro-decisions, branching mechanical paths of judgment and contextual awareness that you might not necessarily be fully conscious of, but are constantly engaged with. These games aren't successful as skateboarding games because Mr. Hawk gives me a gold star every time I do a kickflip. Although, the sound of a special does something that satisfies me in only the way getting your drawing put on the fridge did. They're successful because they gamified physical creativity, engaging tests about quick thinking and character understanding wrapped inside of skating aesthetics. But if that's the case, and these games are so fundamentally similar, why did one end up becoming a multi-million-dollar IP, and the other is misremembered as a game attempting to leech from Tony Hawk's success?
At some point, you just tune everything out and you say, this is it, you gotta do it.
On July 27th of 1999, Tony Hawk would make history with the 900, 2.5 full rotations on a skateboard in a televised format thanks to the X Games 5. You could debate that the landing was sloppy and that it was performed over the official timing, detracting from its importance. But you can't deny that the energy inspired by that half pipe was electric.
Thank you, this is the best day of my life. I swear to God.
And with that, skateboarding was about to hit its stride. As an activity, it was already fairly commonplace. It's deeply ingrained into the counterculture of the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. If we're looking far too deep into it, The Simpsons using skateboarding as one of Bart's main hobbies is reflective of the activities that would have been considered rebellious but commonplace among an American society. Okay, maybe that one's a bit of a stretch. With these layers in place, Tony Hawk became a name that you knew. Maybe not one that you knew well, but enough that it became a powerful marketing tool. In a lineup of games that you might not know anything about, at a time when it was much harder to separate shovelware from shining gem, this name alone was much more likely to gravitate cash towards it. And then, it was good. It was easy to understand and quick to get a grip on without sacrificing mechanical complexity. That made it excellent as a game that just stayed in your PlayStation and kept its place there when local multiplayer came into the mix. Going around a friend's house, it was so quick to understand, but there was so much more for you to learn that you'd be tempted to go out and buy a copy for yourself. This was an issue that Thrasher had thanks to its complicated control scheme. Flips are decided before you leave the ground and grabs as stiff as a deck, which gave it another incorrect branding of simulator. This made it harder to pick up and play, and in a generation where the speed at which you could learn a game was so important, it was crushed under the weight of its competition. Even if, and I get that this is a hot take, Thrasher has an infinitely better song list. Despite its best intentions, Thrasher was lost in the gust of wind created by Tony Hawk's skyrocketing success. So long as you ignore the fact that it's still a publication to this day, and a couple of years ago it somehow became a fashion flash, but I doubt that Neversoft was aware of the monster that they were creating. In the end credits of Pro Skater 1, you can find not only evidence of a team overworked, but also a suggestion that the team wasn't sure if this would be a success at all. Towards the end of the credits, you'll find a question: want to see a sequel? Followed by an email address. When the reviews glowed and Pro Skater ended up being one of the best-selling titles on the system, Neversoft likely didn't need emails to keep going. The request for ideas also implies that they might not have been certain on the direction a sequel should have taken under the circumstances the game did well. Regardless, as a team, they marched towards the future. Unaware of the shockwave of games that they would go on to inspire and genre that they would come to define, they would create one of the most important sequels to find an identity. So now it's Y2K, somehow everyone survived a supposed apocalypse, and Neversoft just created one of the most successful new IPs ever. To put it into perspective, Activision's new cash cow was out milking Madden, NBA, and every single soccer title. So when they decided to pump out a sequel a year later to capitalize on the hype, Neversoft realistically could have squeezed whatever they wanted out of this metaphorical cow. But they didn't just squeeze any game, they squeezed the best game. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 goes so hard. You've got School 2, Bring the Noise, Venice Beach. This game is incredible and makes the bottomless depth of the original Pro Skater feel like child's play. Paddling pool looking ass game. Alright, but why? After all, these games side by side are basically indistinguishable. So much so that I've just put Pro Skater 1 next to each other and I bet you didn't even notice. But there's one addition that changes everything. Something that would fundamentally shift the entire course of Pro Skater and skating games as a whole for years to come. Manuals created a shift in Pro Skater that the franchise would never look back on, going from a game about skateboarding to a custom combo creator in the skateboarding aesthetic. In the first game you might always have choice, but all of the interesting decisions are based on what's around you. Branching paths of increasing risk and reward are only possible when the environment allows for it, and for every mall rail combo and school rail transfer there's ramp. Ooh. In 2, you always have interesting choices through manuals, basically grinds for the flat ground that work off of their own balance meter. While this disconnects your dependency on the environment by simply letting you start a combo off of anywhere you can set your wheels down, it furthers your relationship with the space around you. You're constantly on the lookout for new shit to trick off of, which is a given for both games since the whole scoring system draws you towards tying multiple tricks together, but now the environment has a bigger impact on how you as a player control. Manuals and grinds get progressively harder to balance the longer you're doing them, but with every single new object that you trick off of, you slightly reset the hidden sensitivity of the balance bars. You'd already be looking for new objects to trick off of, because number go up, but those same objects now also become a subconscious resource that you're looking for to keep your combo alive. Distance and density of objects, as well as how they're positioned relative to one another, all become important factors to consider when you're making split-second decisions. You'll almost never be actively thinking about it, but unlike the first game where you're only making choices based on what will get you the most points, now you're also making judgments based on what you as a player are capable of achieving. Two players' perspective on a level will be massively different from one another thanks not only to what they physically can do, but also what they're comfortable doing based on how well they control their character and what type of environment they're in. Each player now has their own unique perspective and preference on how they want to play, leading to the player being able to express themselves. And oh wow, look, it's the whole appeal of skateboarding again. The game hasn't taken away any of the simplicity of the original, it's just increased the potential that you as a player have at your disposal. I know it's only a simple change, but it turns a game that's engaging into a game that's enthralling. It became the kind of game that you'd think about for hours on end, thinking of potential lines and unique ways to get around the level that you just kind of get lost in and can't put down. But unlike time voids like Valorant, even the smallest amount of time was enough to have you walking away with a smile, and without anyone having asked you to walk in front of a train. That's, you know, that's a good plus. The games that followed were just set to keep expanding on opening up the combo system and kept digging away at this gameplay goldmine. 2 added manuals to connect rails to the flat ground, and then 3 added reverts to connect ramps to the flat ground. 4 added spine transfers, and also these fucking tumors. But we're not there yet. Let's just enjoy the game for what it is while we still can. Pro Skater 2 is incredible, and if somehow you've stumbled into this video and you've never played a Tony Hawk game, start with this one. There's no story to put you off, the objectives are super simple, it's just, this game's fucking amazing. 3 is also really good as well, they're the best games on the PlayStation 1. If you disagree with me, you're just wrong. Alright, I'm done gushing now. Naturally, with 2 games that dramatically improved one of the most revered games on the PlayStation 1, it sold way more than the original. Wait, what was that? What the fuck? How? The drop in sales didn't have anything to do with the game directly, or the popularity of skateboarding. If anything, skateboarding and its games were at an all-time high. Tony Hawk wasn't doing a Kramer at the Laugh Factory, it was just selling less. Pro Skater was massively influential in reinforcing and encouraging a generation of young people to go out and skate, but it also encouraged a lot of competition. Even the Skylanders were getting in on the action. Suddenly, the small bowl that Tony Hawk was free skating in quickly became a whole genre skate park that it was competing for. And while that didn't diminish its quality, it meant that it wasn't always in the spotlight. With Pro Skater came a golden age, not just of skateboarding games, but of extreme sports titles. While SSX would actually take more influence from Top Skater and theoretically shouldn't have competed against Pro Skater, the audience who were looking for extreme sports games now had a fissure in their purchasing choice. SSX also beat Tony Hawk to the punch on the PlayStation 2, being a launch title on hardware that, if I remember correctly, you know, I think it did alright. While in their gameplay they might have been very different, in terms of their appeal to the primary demographic of casual audiences, the games were at each other's necks. On top of that, the Birdman would have to compete against games directly trying to leech away some of the market. Grind Session probably had good intentions, it's a very direct copycat, but it's also got enough effort put into it to be an enjoyable time. In some regards, I'd even say that it's better than what it's aping conceptually. It doesn't really feel better to control, but every level has a line system that encourages you to explore the level and plan a route around the space once you know it. It doesn't exactly display it well, but hey, that's an improvement for a sequel. Oh. It's not all doom and gloom though. Shabba Games, the team behind Grind Session, got to work on the PS1 port of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. Then there's games like MTV Presents Skateboarding, which is a control travesty that only puts enough effort in to make you think that you're buying Pro Skater, but not enough to keep up the illusion past the paywall. While these games were around though, most were bailing out after only one game, and in the rare case that they were successful, for some godforsaken reason, they very quickly fizzled out of relevance. Even Activision, the company that published Pro Skater, was chasing after Pro Skater. Matt Hoffmans Pro BMX is a Pro Skater-like that had a demo on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, also developed by Shabba Games, and only had 2 games ever. It unfortunately released after Dave Mirra's Freestyle BMX, probably explaining why it did poorly, which was released by Z-Axis. Wait, what? There's only like 3 companies making extreme sports games. What the fuck's going on? What else have these guys made? Holy shit, these guys are like B-Tech Neversoft. Hold the fucking horses! The problems that all of these games have is that they're all derivative of Pro Skater rather than their own distinct iterations on a formula. All that really did was serve to highlight the quality that Pro Skater put into games about combos and the environment. skateboarding games, and even some non-skateboarding games, were Pro Skater. Whether or not you were playing it, everyone was trying to recreate it. In a rare moment of bliss, Tony Hawk was standing at the top of an entire market that they'd created. Not the guy, the team at Neversoft. Mr. Hawk was also doing quite well at the time, though the games had transcended the name that helped to market it. It took a long time to get here, but it feels like games about skateboarding were finally becoming the games that they should have always been. When the next generation of consoles released, skateboarding games started to encounter a problem. What should have been a fantastic genre breaking the shackles of its hardware somehow became a clarity that revealed an uncanny valley. Nobody knew what made Pro Skater fun. The PlayStation 2 and GameCube could have been pivotal for the genre. Tony Hawk was a household name, and with the prominence of SSX, there was proof that there was a large enough audience for two to tango in the extreme sports space without directly imitating each other. But old habits die hard, and skating games just loved a cheeky can of Stella, especially when behind the wheel. Not as much as you might think though. This is every single skateboarding game that I could find in this time period after what I would undebatably call the height of popularity in the genre. Some of these games are abhorrent. I poke fun at League of Legends to get all coy with the "ho, this game's so bad" rhetoric, but you have not played a torturously terrible video game until you've touched the Simpsons waterboarding. Shovelware so abysmal that it brings shame to the rest of the hobbling freak show that Tony Hawk spawned. There's so much wrong with this game that I'm just not going to start. I wouldn't stop if I did. Fuck this game, we're moving on. While I wouldn't describe any of the other games that released as good, these games do at least have some element of love behind them. There was clearly some passion put into these projects, but once you sit down and play them, you very quickly feel a lack of polish and direction that the Tony Hawk franchise had established. Too early and failed attempts at emulating the stylistic choices of Tom and Jerry as well as Ren and Stimpy and Go-Go Hypergrind, the restructuring of Tony Hawk to fit a more action-driven experience in AirBlade, and the absolutely schizophrenic nature of Evolution Skateboarding, every game that wasn't Pro Skater would fall out of the development oven far too early. That last game I mentioned might seem a bit out of place. Looking at this footage right now, Konami's Evolution Skateboarding might seem like a simple Tony Hawk clone, and for the most part you'd be right. The first level is fairly typical. Reach a score, collect an item, move on to the next level, the standard affair. It's a little odd that the next level is a cartoonishly evil castle, a bit out of place, but I mean, like, Tony Hawk had Roswell, so it's not too uncommon to stray into a fictional setting. And then you fight a giant spider crab so that you can go to Metal Gear Solid's mother base so that you can fight an oil truck, and suddenly the game that I wanted to put down 5 minutes ago still sucks. But that was an enjoyable fever dream, I'll give you that. This game's like a bad trip. Funny in retrospect, remembering the peaks of the waking nightmare, but agonizingly slow and uneventful in the moment. The rare conceptual flashbang aside though, this game is a poor imitation of Tony Hawk. You've got a turn that's more akin to a car than a skateboard, but levels often require you to traverse them in a non-linear fashion whilst also having those levels rarely loop back on themselves. You have an accurate push to speed up, but that means that you can't accelerate and prep an ollie at the same time in levels that often have obstacles densely packed together. Tricking and combos almost never have any relevance to the game, with a larger emphasis on collectibles and exploring a level. That's not inherently a problem, it makes me question why you'd pose the whole title around skateboarding, but when the objectives and levels don't suit the mechanics, you don't just shove them into an engine and hope for the best, you make a different fucking game! Haphazard levels can complement a game built around collectibles, but Lightning McQueen here is built for combos, and last time I checked they weren't holding the F1 on Spiral fucking Mountain. Tricking on a rail is fine, but since lining up with it is tedious, and traversing to it is tedious, and the ramps suck balls, and doing the manuals hold wide, but the ollie is on A, so I have to Dark Souls claw grip my controller if I want to do a normal ollie height. Why would I not just play Pro Skater 2? Evolution Skateboarding does have hints of decent ideas inside of it, and when it stops clinging to convention, it's a clunky yet enjoyable spectacle. But I'm not a petrol station, and brief sparks of joy aren't enough to make me gleefully blow up. In the final level, you fight a stereotyping tank.
He has occupied this car. Command and surrender without
And that's the big issue with the handful of games that came out during this era. Not the stereotyping, kinda. The good ideas are marred by a layer of clashing concepts or an intense lack of polish. Go-Go Hypergrind is really rough around the edges, but it tries to...
The cat being covered in what you might perceive to be cum has made me scared to show any more footage of this game. It does some contextual stuff in the environment, it's really not that important. It was okay. Didn't need to cover the cat in cum. Next game!
AirBlade isn't a game about skateboards. I know, it's hoverboards, it's different, Dad. But tell me this isn't heavily inspired by Tony Hawk and I'll personally come to your house and credit card you. It's got a good idea in here. Actually, I'd go one further. It's a great idea. The scoring system in Tony Hawk is great, but it's disconnected from the rest of the objectives. Goals are laid out like a list of chores, and once you've done something once, you can ignore it and you never have to do it again. Your score is one of them, and that's great because it means that you can complete that goal while you're doing other tasks built around collectibles. But if you reach the score and you still have other tasks to complete, there's very little reason to keep tricking and engaging with the most enjoyable system, especially as juggling exploration and tricking can slow you down and distract you from actually finding what you're looking for. AirBlade, on the other hand, ties tricking to the level as a constant goal, where you're asked to complete every other task to finish a level and graded on the score you got while you were comboing towards all of them goals. Kinda like a character action game, but you can do every task in whatever order and complete them partially whilst completing other tasks. There's also no special meter, but instead a boost, which is gained by tricking, intertwining tricking and movement together in a whole new way. This sounds fucking amazing, right? It's like an actual evolution of skateboarding games, modernized in a way to make it enjoyable for people who don't give a shit about decks and wheels, but done as early as 2001. This game must be incredible, right? Right?
We'll see about that.
Oh no. Let's get this straight. AirBlade is not actually a bad game, but it's been drinking, and much like how I can love my parents in concept, that doesn't mean I can ignore the borderline abusive alcoholics they are. Maybe that one's a bit of an overshare. That's not because all of the pieces of AirBlade are bad, far from it. The combo system's pretty fun, even in the absence of any manuals to connect everything together, the mission structure is interesting, and the aesthetic, while bland, is at least charmingly garish, although maybe that one's just me. The real problems are just portions in the execution of concepts. The camera is so far up your arse I could mistake it for a colonoscopy, and is constantly pointing at where you will go, rather than revealing what's around you and where you want to go. The non-linear structure of objectives is great, but it's placed inside of levels that instead of looping back around on themselves often require you to backtrack, where it's not uncommon for objectives to be positioned in pockets that don't allow you to complete other objectives on the way. You're only told that you have an objective after you've finished another objective, so your first time around a level isn't explorative, but instead following a game of connect the dots. Even with an arrow pointing you to your next objective, you'll still end up lost, because the colonoscopy cam never lets you see enough around the space to gain a proper idea of how the space works. You carry a completely inconsistent amount of momentum across the level, even when you have boost to speed you up. It's an accumulation of little problems that stops AirBlade from hitting the very high highs that it should have hit, but it doesn't. And with that goes another game onto the pile of mediocrity. It's not like Criterion didn't try. There's a making of video on the disc, and you can tell that the team there gave it their all, even if the video that proves it is wank. What could have been a new game to rival the likes of Tony Hawk's and SSX by taking extreme sports as a basis to produce a character action game type experience is again lost to the realm of forgotten video games. Maybe if this game got a sequel to round off its many edges, it could have been great, but it never got that chance. So it turns out this game is actually a spiritual sequel already to a game called Trickstyle that released on the Sega Dreamcast, and I didn't know about it, so I'm not going to talk about it because this video is already fucking an hour long and it's 5 in the morning and I just want to finish the video, man. And that is kind of a problem. Unlike other sports titles, the best skateboarding video games have always been placed in an air of fantasy. Even as early as 720, these aren't humanly attainable stunts. The quality of the title doesn't come from the simulation. They're more interesting when designed as conventional games. A quality of conventional games is seeing how different developers apply the same fundamentals to create diverse experiences, and if there's enough variety of quality games, you're able to establish a healthy genre. The first-person shooter shooter as a genre is so healthy because you have an immensely diverse set of games. Ones that cater to playing alone, playing online, playing in teams, playing fast, playing slow, emphasizing nearly every element of gameplay. If one of these games was to suddenly flop and do poorly, the genre would be fine, because there's a catalogue of games that are both diverse enough to attract new players and also actively competing for the same spot that game would occupy. Anyway, I'm sorry for going on a side tangent. I'm sure it won't be important later. All we can do now is return to old reliable Tony Hawk's Pro Skater in the sequel, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, and oh my god, what happened? Pro Skater 4 is simultaneously one of the best in the series, as well as the game that almost killed the franchise. And even when Underground revitalized interest a year later, the scars of 4's design choices burned its way through every subsequent game. I will never forgive Neversoft for the crime that is the most 5 out of 10 experience I have ever played. I would say I'm going to return your studio to rubble, but it would appear that Activision beat me to the punch. So yeah, you could say I have problems with this game. But if you were paying attention, you might have noticed that I laced my sentence with a whole lot of not making any fucking sense. This is one of the best Tony Hawk games. Its controls and physics were so good that it would go nearly entirely unaltered at all for future games, just adding systems to the already incredible feeling of control that you had over your character. So what's wrong? Is Leon being a big baby again? Am I being a big baby again? Oh, my childhood wasn't as good as I remember, and oh, maybe my parents' divorce had a bigger impact on me than I thought. I'm not being a big baby, this game sucks dick! 4 replaced something that was very important, but wasn't very loud. An invisible constant of all 3 games that came before it, that even the games that were imitating Pro Skater were taking from: mission design.
It's me, Mario!
Super Mario 64 is a 3D platformer released by Nintendo in 1996 for the Nintendo 64. In it, you guide Mario through a collection of levels presented in the form of paintings to collect stars to save Princess Peach. That end goal will be out of your mind, however, since most of the fun comes from controlling Mario and exploring the environment. Each level has 7 stars, the best of which are open-ended goals that simply ask you to get around the level using Mario's immensely diverse moveset, the worst of which are the ones that ask you to overcome extremely specific hurdles unrelated to movement. I bring all of this up because it allows me to make this cheap visual gag, but also because Tony Hawk is now Mario, for better and much more for worse. The movement is the best it's ever been, and the levels already accommodated exploration, but the objectives are hyper-specific, unbearably railroaded chores that ask nothing of your ability to put pieces of a moveset together, instead asking you to put shapes into holes. Do these tricks. Grind this rail. Do these tricks over a man. Isn't this gameplay? You'd occasionally find these types of tasks in Pro Skater 2, but there, they served a different purpose, along with every other objective. Levels weren't just slapping on a set of scores and spilling a bunch of letters into the environment, they acted as candy collections to entice a player to explore the level and their moveset simultaneously. Even objectives like nose grind over the halfpipe in 2 have value. Like many of Pro Skater's objectives, on its own, it's boring, but as a piece of a larger whole that you can complete simultaneously, it becomes an engaging request for you to analyze the environment and consider how you might complete the task while progressing towards another. There might only be one way to complete the task, but how you connect that to every other objective will be different from every single player, and reinforces the strength of Pro Skater's player expression. The times when objectives were at their worst were when you only had one more to complete, and the task was isolated from the context of other goals. Sure would be fucking dumb to build a whole game like that. Oh, build a whole game? I can do that. I'll go do it right now. That's not what I fucking mean! Regardless of its mechanical strength, the partitioning of tasks never demands that you find solutions to problems or consider the level as a whole piece. When you can only have one challenge active at a time, missions become a list of chores rather than a catalyst for creative play. You walk up to someone, activate their given challenge, and then play patty cake with them, yearning for the days when 5 floating letters starting with S was a strong enough start for you to finish it with Eamon. I just can't understate to you how big of a downgrade this is. It's not the only problem. The levels don't loop back on themselves as effectively as the previous games, and the constant voice lines are obnoxious.
Nice, kid. You got skill.
British.
Blimey. A pro score, but quite difficult.
But all of the gameplay problems revolve around the incredibly boring mission design that doesn't complement the type of game that Tony Hawk is, and has been for 3 years up until this point. Actually, that might be the exact reason that this change got made. 3 games over 3 years that realistically aren't that distinct from one another makes for a hard sell when the next year rolls around, unless you've got an audience as dense as the British public.
Good morning, guys.
The franchise was also built on top of game design that unfortunately just isn't prone to longevity. Fast, arcadey gameplay just doesn't really do well in the long run. Just look at Crazy Taxi, Super Monkey Ball, every light gun game. These games had a couple of breakout titles, but now the franchises, if they're not resigned to niches, are effectively dead. And don't come crying to me that they're not dead, you're the big baby now. In an attempt to escape that trap and shake things up, Neversoft likely tried to reformat Tony Hawk by taking what would appear to be its most malleable element and modernizing it to make the game fresh, even if that fresh wasn't necessarily better. While 4 reviewed well at the time, the lasting result is a game that feels scattered in its ideas, a game with slightly more parts but a considerably lower sum than the games that came before it. Despite that, the game still sold well, but maybe not as well as Activision and Neversoft had hoped for. It still shipped 1 million copies on the PlayStation 2, but when Pro Skater 3 shipped 2 million copies on the PlayStation 1, and also on the PlayStation 2, it had to be a bit of a letdown. Tony Hawk as a brand still had pull, but maybe professional skateboarding wasn't accelerating along with the games in popularity. Skating remained more popular as a reflection of personal background and values based in disestablishment, still strong among teens and young adults embodying a reckless lifestyle. So it became the time for a rebrand. Underground. It's gritty. It's got cars. It's not about whatever the first 4 games are about anymore. It's about you. If you thought it was all downhill from here, Jam's 3 years away. This is the cocaine, leave your wife and kids portion of the crisis, aka the best, so long as you look at it from the right angle, time of your life. Using 4 as a foundation, Underground reframed an entire game to complement what was previously shitty design. Further removing itself from the arcades 90s roots, Underground follows an actual story of becoming a pro skater, lost in a limbo somewhere between sequel and prequel, like it's Schrodinger's Skater, except that's not how Schrodinger's cat works, but hey, this is a skateboarding game where sometimes you drive cars, so really I'm working within the game's logic if you think about it. Linear chores are now supplemented with an element of context to provide actions with purpose. And while that doesn't excuse or even necessarily fix poor design choices, it presents it with enough charm and knowledge of its own contrivances that they're at least cute attempts at entertainment. Your car to the amateur contest got busted for a broken taillight, so now you're the policeman's errand boy because you're just like David Cameron.
We like cops.
Some random broke into the bank and left a trail of floating dollars. Go and collect them so that learn how to boneless from the 2000s stereotype of Asian American chefs. Let's hope that doesn't evolve into an even more blatantly racist caricature in a future game. This game is silly. A key plot point is doing a McTwist over a helicopter off of an apartment block, but it doesn't wallow in its own ridiculousness. It takes its plot centered around betrayal and revenge seriously enough to try its hardest in its performance, but isn't afraid to crack a smile when the audience can't help but laugh at the absurdity of its nature. The story's as dumb as a rock, but in that stupidity it finds some real charm, and that acts as the perfect glue to help string together all of its different gameplay elements. Sometimes missions still drag. Being asked to repeat a list of tricks for 2 straight minutes that asks nothing of your ability to think about the systems at play is still not interesting, but compared to 4 especially, it's got a much firmer grip on what challenges are engaging in this environment compared to obnoxious. The worst is certainly still here, but now there's way more instances of open-ended objectives, often being get to point X remixed to encourage you to view the environment differently, or specific lines that act as a test of dexterity. I mean, it doesn't provide nearly the same level of expression and flexibility found in the best 2 games, but compared to what stumbled out of Neversoft's womb a year prior, it's steering back towards what people loved about Pro Skater 2 and 3, mechanical freedom wrapped in skateboarding theatrics. It wasn't always really about skateboarding, but it was successful at telling a story whilst using it as a vehicle to occasionally excellent gameplay, and occasionally really bad gameplay. This game is genuinely good, and placing itself inside of a fictional world instead of a neutral sandbox that the previous entries were, this game should have done incredibly well. And it did. It's one of the best-selling games in the series, it reviewed exceptionally well, it found its footing even if it did abandon better design choices. Finally, some good news! 4 was just a lull in quality, skateboarding games can still be good! If Underground was a narcotic-induced bender, its sequel is a painful hangover the next day that has you wondering where you are. Awful levels, terrible mission structure, and a story that's so quick to assume that everything that it does is comedic that it can't even stumble into the self-awareness to be ashamed when it shits itself. This game is bad, abysmal even, but even more insulting than any of that is that it's not even uniquely terrible. Again, we've got the same moveset and the way that you traverse the world, another game that could have conceptually been fantastic, but unlike Underground 1 where a story complements play, here a story wraps its tendrils around every system and infects it. That's all thanks to Jackass, a film based around the pain and humiliation of its eccentric cast of adrenaline junkies, some of which were already famous skaters. That's not to say that Jackass is bad, it's not really my thing, but in 2002 it was not only shocking, but gripping to a generation of angsty teens. So Neversoft, already making games for an activity that was historically popular among teens, took extremely heavy inspiration from the film, effectively making a movie tie-in game in everything but name. Pretty simple premise, you get kidnapped by Bam Margera and the gang of definitely not Jackass to go on the World Destruction Tour. A vague journey of slapstick comedy, clearly inspired by the cast that it largely included. The issue is that any attempt at a laugh here doesn't exactly land. When all hell breaks loose in Jackass, there's a shock value that comes from the knowledge that this is happening to real people. You don't have to be an empath to realize that maybe they're in a lot of pain and that they've only got themselves to blame for it. Whether or not the emotion that inspires inside of you is something that you enjoy, it is something that will be valuable to someone out there. Without the knowledge that what's happening on screen is real, Jackass would just become a mess of disconnected ideas that isn't shocking or funny, and oh wow, look who stumbled in. Thug 2 is obnoxious. It's got a theme of belligerence and disorder that it doesn't really use to tell jokes, instead gingerly pointing towards a punchline without setup, context, or consequence. It might seem like I'm a little hung up on the story, and you'd be right, but the reason that it irks me so much inside of my mechanically driven character skateboarding game is because it's not just limited to the cutscenes. This is a theme that runs through the entire game, so much so that a lot of missions are designed around it. All of the interesting multi-layered decision-making and tight reflexive gameplay that has been built up throughout the years gets abandoned for throw tomatoes at pedestrians, abduct a child, play as Steve-O. You know Steve-O, right player? That means that you like it. And you clap your hands like a seal in agreement as you order more fucking Funko Pops. These missions aren't fun to play, and while they could be engaging with some pretty dramatic overhauls, the big issue is that they're being born from the wrong ideas. The themes are what created these missions, and whether or not that's fun to play comes later, or in this case, not at all. That's not to say that there aren't games out there that can be built from aesthetic concepts and work well. I do know what the MDA framework is, leave me the fuck alone. But the mechanically driven franchise that's using the exact same engine as the last game maybe isn't the place to do that. That's the big difference between Thug 1 and 2. The original uses a story and theme to contextualize gameplay, but here the story and theme, which is already rocky on its own, is being used to create situations irrespective of how the gameplay fits into it. This has a bunch of knock-on effects to the rest of the game, even if it is indirect. Even when trying to wrangle back towards the types of missions that were prevalent in 4, they stick out for the straight lines that they are. There's nothing in this game that encourages you to be creative through play. It reduces all of the appeal that had been built up through the series since the original Pro Skater down to stains in Neversoft's cookware. I finished Thug 2 for this video, twice, and I fucking hated it both times. But there was one specific point that almost had me throwing in the towel, and to me is indicative of the game's entire problem. In a game all about skateboarding, how would you complete the mission, wake up this builder? Maybe grind the vehicle he's in? Perhaps it's got something to do with the statue's head that he's holding. Other than that, there doesn't seem to be an obvious solution. It's definitely got something to do with the machine that he's in, but I can't figure it out. The solution is actually to walk across the street to a fire hydrant that you need to Nata spin so that you can trigger a cutscene where the fire hydrant pings off of his window and wakes him up. Outside of a menu telling you the solution, there is no indication of how to solve this. Much like everything in this game, it's poorly thought out, frustrating, and doesn't utilize the most interesting layering of mechanics to encourage any kind of creative thinking from the player. I could piss and shit my diaper for another hour over this game, and maybe one day I might, but ultimately any complaints that I could have would be repeating myself, and I've at least got enough shame to know when you've had enough of my shit and that we should move on. Underground 2 somehow reviewed well at the time, but it was also the worst reviewing game in the franchise's release up until this point, so long as you disregard the GBA titles. At the time, Tony Hawk was still being praised, but maybe people weren't enjoying the newer titles as much as they might have initially thought. Recency bias can be a real bitch and mar your view on how good a product actually is. Underground 2 sold well, but at the same time it didn't hit nearly the same heights as the game that was released just a year prior. With that, Tony Hawk was stuck in an odd spot. It had soared to the heights of Smash success, but it was time for its fall from grace. So it's 2005 now. The last Tony Hawk game was a bit of a mixed bag even by its own standards, and it seems like the prime time for a new franchise to come along and take the crown of the best skating game for the year. Let's see who's contending for the crown. From this point forward, Tony Hawk was alone. Nobody was making skateboarding games, and in that isolation, the series would begin to fester. Between 2005 and 2007, 4 games would release, each of them unremarkable, but all of them indicative of the cancer that was now terminal. Tony was on death's door, and instead of accepting that his time had come, would attempt to burn his lineage in an attempt to barter for more time. Not the guy, the games, you know, Tony Hawk's still kicking. As a fan of the franchise, the roughest part about this era of games specifically is that they're the worst kind of games to talk about for the exact same reason that they're a drag to play. These games aren't bad, they're boring. American Wasteland is a repeat of all the worst design choices the series has had up until this point. Downhill Jam is a decent 20-minute game drawn out over the course of several hours, ruining the enjoyable novelty that it could have been. Project 8 and Proving Grounds are bizarre middle grounds of games that want to allude to a realism that it never commits to, making too little changes to appeal to the people looking for a simulator, and making just enough changes to fucking shatter the interest of the established audience. That's everything that's notable about these games from a purely gameplay perspective. Oh, except this.
And always remember this one ancient Chinese proverb. Kicks a major butthole, boy.
See, I told you it gets racist. What's more interesting about these games is seeing why they were made the way they were. Take American Wasteland, for example. Why does this game exist? Underground 1 exists specifically to see if you can tell a story through 4's game engine, and Underground 2 exists as a homage to Jackass. But Wasteland? Wasteland exists because Tony Hawk was still Activision's cash cow. In the current day, Activision as a publisher is probably best known for Call of Duty, and for some reason Sekiro, but at the time their big yearly release that was guaranteed to at least pull in sizable money was Tony Hawk. The brand was so recognizable that every game was a safe bet, and the money generated there would go on to fund their more experimental ventures. So don't change anything, this is the safe bet, to the point that even changing stagnant elements and replacing them with fresh ideas could threaten that all-important formula. This game exists with all of the previous game's failings intact because the product was made to produce profit, not push boundaries. But then as 2006 rolled around the corner, a real issue arose. A new generation of hardware was getting started, and interest in the franchise was trailing off. So much so that I cannot even find sales data for American Wasteland. It's enough to make you think that maybe the series needs a year off to give it time to incorporate some dramatic new ideas that could revitalize the once great franchise, wrote Jeff Gerstmann in his review of American Wasteland. And really, he was right. So instead of taking time off, the franchise shit the bed and made 2 games in a year that are completely different from one another. Fuck you! Project 8, developed by Nethersoft, and Downhill Jam, developed by Toys for Bob, are completely different games with very specific purposes. They both wanted to pull the franchise in different directions in the hope of gaining a new audience. But like strangers in a crowd, they were just another name and face to be forgotten. Downhill Jam was made by the team who made Disney's Extreme Skate Adventure, a commercial product that's actually a mod for Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 to be reskinned around Disney characters. This is real, and yes, it has Macdonald's branding. This title focuses on downhill gameplay with different missions isolating racing and tricking, being completely linear tracks that have shortcuts scattered around the space. A pretty fresh direction for Tony Hawk that's fairly original. I'm so sorry, I spilled on my SSX footage, I'm so silly. The thing is, Downhill Jam is a fine game. It gets a bad rep for abandoning what people like about Tony Hawk, but there's nothing really wrong here. It's fine, but it's also actively pushing against SSX's gameplay, which has already been refined and also kind of lost its appeal. 2005's SSX On Tour reviewed poorly and isn't really talked about, which is a worrying indication of where the Tony Hawk franchise is heading. Instead of making a new game and subverting expectations, this game instead followed the path of another title to redundancy. The more toony visuals failed to capture a younger, more casual audience, and the hardware that it was locked onto, the fact that it would compete against itself in the same year, and the derivative nature of its own existence would fail to capture any of the core audience as well. Project 8, on the other hand, is a much more true-to-form Tony Hawk experience, but at this point, is that really a positive? What Project 8 does change is its tone. Unlike Underground 2 and American Wasteland, Project 8 starts to lean into the fetish of the 7th generation. Realism. Keep in mind this was just a year before the modern military shooter would rise to prominence to behead the arena shooter and the generation that popularized this color palette. Realism had always, and to a certain extent will always, be sought after, but in this specific moment in time it was the thing to tap into. Project 8 does attempt that, but it only gets halfway there. There's a thematic and mechanical disconnect that tugs the game in two directions, dissatisfying both parties in the process. I've seen more color in the angst of Dishwasher the Vampire Smile than the open world of this visual snooze fest. Yeah, it's an open world, by the way. But the core gameplay is still this arcadey hyper movement that poses you doing cartoonishly elaborate stunts. The game is full of tasks that are more grounded in the reality of professional skating at the time, like photo shoots and spot reels that ask you to perform a very specific list of tricks. But like all of the fucking games that came before it, none of that complements the gameplay. There's this new create a trick system that tries to have you flicking the board as if it was a physical object like a real skateboard that isn't actually reflective of real skateboarding in the slightest. That's not like the real issue with the system, but like, you can do late flips in real life, but the way that it's done here would just have the board shoot out from under you, since you're kicking it away from you without the friction and ability to jump above the board that keeps you under it. Yes, I am going on a side tangent, let me have this! And while fun is a brief novelty, it needs to be part of a larger whole to make it interesting. But in the larger whole of Tony Hawk's combo system, it just ends up detracting from it, thanks to how it brings the pace of a game to a screeching halt. The end result is a game that never finds its audience. It's not grounded enough to appeal to actual skaters, and this game, along with the last three mainline Tony Hawk titles, keeps making sacrifices that never lets its mechanical loop hit the heights that it was reaching all the way back in 2001. The games might not have dramatically changed, but it was missing the soul of freedom that skating provided. Whether or not people could identify what was different, they could definitely feel it. For many people, Project 8 was the final nail in Tony Hawk's coffin, not thanks to a digital fumble the likes of Duke Nukem Forever, more mediocrity and middle ground slowly pushing people away. And without an alternative for people to look forward to, skating games as a whole were knocking on death's door. Tony Hawk used to be the pioneer of skateboarding gameplay, and while it wasn't always true to the activity it was based on, it was so deeply engaging you had other games desperately attempting to duplicate its glory. Haggard, frail, and nearing the end, the series was grasping at straws, crawling towards whatever trend would keep it alive for just another year. What once was slamming halfpipes, hitting big air, and breaking new records, was now clawing at the coping of relevance. In 2007, Neversoft would make one last attempt to impress before being shoveled off to the Guitar Hero series with Proving Ground, another rehash of all of Project 8's failings with no redeeming qualities. As the critics weighed it in as another performance failing to capture the fire that once burned so bright, a grip that was once so strong started to give way. As the hand of the Birdman loosened, so too did the chances of skateboarding as a genre ever returning to its glory days. Like a guardian angel, EA shattered the heavens to arrive on the halfpipe of the gaming market with Skate. A new series so grounded it single-handedly redefined what skateboarding as a collection of games could be. Tony Hawk was past his prime, but in skating's darkest hour, a hero arrived. And then Tony Hawk had 2 games that used peripheral controllers. They reviewed poorly and I didn't play them. Who gives a shit? I don't know who EA hired in the late 2000s, but whoever it was, they had a keen eye for greenlighting shit nobody asked for. What if zombies, but in space? What if Mario, but in first person? And a gun? What if skateboarding? And then they passed out mid-sentence and forgot what the gimmick was supposed to be. So everyone just shrugged and went, fuck it. Judgment on whether or not that was a good idea put to the wayside, EA Black Box got to work on competing for a monopoly that wasn't even that valuable anymore. But with a twist. Remember Tony Hawk? Don't. Abandon everything that you know about skating games. That might be scary, but make sure you're the right kind of scared. This isn't the fear in a late night viewing of Noroi the Curse. This is a first date with the most beautiful woman you've ever seen being threatened by an imminent shot. What I'm trying to say is this shit's real! Probably thanks to the generation's lust for realism, Skate set out to create something that's more akin to a simulator than a game. Now that might seem like a recipe for disaster. After all, one of the things that led to Project 8 being such a flop was the elements of reality it attempted to emulate. However, realism in that context was at odds with a more bombastic nature of play. The issue wasn't realism, it was that it conflicted with Tony Hawk's larger whole. When that realism is committed to, and you're willing to abandon convention and expectation in the pursuit of a unique vision, well, you get Skate. A title that on paper seems like a repetitive tech demo. You do tricks, you ride around, that's about it. In practice though, it becomes this almost zen-like experience that's hard to put your finger on why exactly it works. So strap in, kids, I'm about to go on for the next minutes about a game that I couldn't figure out how to properly analyze. And unless Skate catches the eye of Joseph Matosis guy, then that might be the best analysis this game ever gets. Skate isn't appealing in the conventional sense of games. It's closer to the fun of Halo's Forge mode rather than the structure of its single player. It's effectively just a sandbox with an interesting physics system that the player interacts with, a lot like real skateboarding. Are there missions? Yes. Are they bad? Mostly yes. But that's clearly not the game's goal. Skate's at its best when it just plops you in an environment and lets you figure out how to do some cool looking shit off of what's around you. And also, how do I do a kickflip? Why do I keep pushing wrong when I go to do an ollie? The first thing that will hit you before anything else hits are the flicker controls, a unique system where your right analog stick controls all of your tricks by doing specific motions to make moves happen. It's like a Street Fighter, but easier. Now some of you might be looking at this and going, well, this seems like some unnecessary bullshit, but repeat after me, control schemes are gameplay. We all love a good tank control, and if you don't, I wasn't aware you were so uncultured. I'm sorry, but you're not welcome here. This isn't the right video for you. And what the tank controls do to ground you in horror by obscuring your input to reinforce panic and fear, this control scheme is fantastic at providing the illusion of reality. You can wiggle the stick around like a madman and have things happen, but if you want to actually be specific about the type of trick that you do, or do more elaborate tricks, you have to focus. Think about how your thumb moves around your controller. At first, this control scheme is tricky to work with, but as time goes on, you start to view the bottom half of the stick as your back foot and the top half as controlling your front foot, thanks to how actions align with animations. The board isn't flipping because you're pressing the right button, it's flipping because your feet are interacting with the board's physics in just the right way. The controls generate immersion, because the actions required for the character are somewhat reflected in your reality as a struggle with the controller. But it's also a lie. The flick it system does require more effort on your part, but the feeling that it corresponds to with your character's feet isn't real. You can make a flip go faster by inputting a motion quicker, but every kick flip, laser flip, any flip, is not a culmination of physics, it's a state that you enter once you've input the right code. It's effectively pressing the right button with extra steps. Now that might seem like a damning condemnation of this system, but let's just get this straight. this is a good thing. Skateboarding in reality is a very complex interaction with physics where shitloads can go wrong. Could you imagine playing a skating game where you have to heel flip in just the right way to not have the board kick out from under you? Fuck that! It would be frustrating and require you to have too much preliminary knowledge of how skating works to do anything correctly. It would be more true to reality, but would make for a considerably worse game. This control scheme rides a perfect line between demanding enough to enhance your immersion without being so demanding that it reminds you that you're interacting with a tangled mess of if statements. When this control scheme collides with the seemingly offhand nature of its physics to produce grinds, it becomes much harder to draw the line between a gamey state and a collection of logical processes producing an outcome. When you position the board just right and just so happen to land on a ledge sideways, producing a board slide, it presents the situation as though that slide is an organic culmination of circumstance, even if in reality, that's not inherently true. There's a slight magnetism that draws you towards rails, and once you're in a grind, the character has behavioral alterations to make that experience much smoother and consistent than if it were truly an outcome of circumstance. It feels like me alone put all the pieces together to make that trick occur, because I ollied up to the rail in just the right way, and I angled the board in the definitely super specific requirement, but it's all an illusion. A carefully constructed stage play that convinces you that none of that was planned. That was definitely all you, kid, when really, the game had it prepared the whole time. Meanwhile, Tony Hawk, you press a triangle, do grind. This is what I meant by the illusion of reality. Skate wants you to feel like a cool guy. It wants you to feel like you're the skater, so it's constantly throwing you bones, both in its trick flick system and its physics to ensure that it's still a challenge to do the things that you envision, but not a freak accident that you always get it after 5 or so tries. Everything is presented as enough of an abstraction to be unconventionally engaging, without being so complex that it becomes aggravating. What you get is a game like nothing you've experienced in the 20+ years of skating games. Satisfaction oozes from every minute situation by offering legitimately elaborate stunts the precision required to be genuine achievements, while also secretly supporting you enough to never put what you would consider to be cool out of arm's reach. It's the joys in expression through skateboarding in its truest digital form. It's still not a simulator though. You can't jump this many steps in real life, no matter how many times you show me the Jaws Leon 25. What helps to keep it together as a game is also its lack of pressure that it puts on you. Even when the game does give you concrete goals, it's normally super laid back on its difficulty and puts no urgency into the situations, which for a game with a more complicated input system is basically a requirement. Yanya Kabbalista tried to make a genuinely complex input system by using both sticks to recreate a skateboard, and it kinda sucked. The controls aren't the best. They don't follow through with the control premise the way that Skate does, but the bigger issue is how it's confusing and difficult to be precise in a gameplay system focused around abstract controls when you're constantly put under pressure. I can't count how much time do I have left. As soon as that far, am I already dead? How the fuck do I do a kickflip? This pressure from the controls creates a frustration when pressed against a mission structure that ignores that struggle. So you can't do Tony Hawk here. You can't do bombastic, loud, fucking Bam Margera gameplay. It's a lot slower. It's less focused. We're just kind of vibing. Look at this. Yeah. And a lot of people liked that change of pace when they'd had so many years of get that fucking number up, go to the next bit, go bitch, you fucking love Motorhead! There's a relaxed tone in Skate that couldn't be found in any other title at the time, driven through its mechanics and structure. For all of this quality, however, it's hard to judge whether or not this is a novelty. Now, just because... grow. If Skate wanted to develop into a series, it would have to incorporate some kind of progression, even if that was the typical sport angle of incorporating the current teams and players, or in this case, skaters and sponsors. I've used Skate 1 and 2 footage interchangeably because admittedly between games there wasn't this progression, instead a refinement that is good, but didn't create quite the same wow in the year between these games' releases. The changes are seemingly minuscule effects for the already incredible sandbox. A different soundtrack that's actually better, altered visuals, and the life-changing ability to get off of your skateboard. Ooh, wow, I'm so impressed. But these small changes indicate that Skate, while incredibly good, probably didn't have the maneuverability to become a major new blockbuster IP. More a niche that never captures a massive audience, but holds a special and quiet place in the hearts of the people that played it. Then Skate 3 happened, and oh lord, people love this game. It might not have reviewed quite as well as 1 and 2, but in the eyes of the people, Skate 3 was briefly captivating and seared a very distinct memory into those that played it. People love this game so much, it re-entered the top 10 UK sales charts as late as 2020. This game was made in 2010! People are still making videos about this game to this day. So something must have changed to cause this, right? This game must have been Skate's Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. But it wasn't. It's still the same game. Skate never had this fundamental shift in ideas, making this title's success a bit of an anomaly. You can point towards refinements that reinforced the quality of the previous games. There was a park builder and a greater range of tricks that you can do, expanding the sandbox elements, but I don't really think that gets to the core of why Skate 3 was so reveled in. Because when I think of Skate 3, I think of glitches. On release, this game was riddled with bugs, and in every other circle, I would consider that a bad thing. But we're not in every other circle. Glitches in Skate 3 actually enhanced the title, even if the effects that they had were, illusion of realism, huh? We're in a sandbox. As far as people are concerned, there ain't no point to the game. So when most of the glitches were new abuses of the systems that caused unexpected but not unpredictable outcomes and were recreatable whilst never obstructing standard play, a lot of people liked them. This, in hand with the developing standardization of the very platform that you're watching this video on, meant that people were sharing the absurd ragdolls and dumb outcomes of situations, turning Skate 3 effectively into a comedy game. It was a lot like how people use Gmod. Yeah, there's an intended purpose to that sandbox, but the nature of the sandbox means that players were finding their own value inside of the systems. Difference here is that once the player got tired of all the glitches, there was still an incredibly interesting game underneath it all, that maybe might not have been in the player's interest otherwise, but kept people captivated regardless. Today, Skate 3 is still remembered as an overtly funny game, but it also grabbed some of the players going in solely for giggles and kept them playing for the joys of all the games that came before it. Skate 3 attempted to expand its sandbox, and for all the ways that it intentionally went about that expansion, it was also lucky to expand in many positive, unintentional ways. The outcome of that is a game that left people hungry for more, and the popularity of this game alone, well, it was the start of the future. Skating games were back. Far different from how they were before, but loved from an entirely new perspective. Despite what Tony Hawk had done a couple of years prior, there was clearly still gas left in this genre's tank, and it was time for the genre to ride towards a new beginning. Almost as quick as it came, Skate suddenly vanished from the spotlight. What seemed like a new dawn for skating games was merely a flashbang, and by the time the blinding light had faded, the market had already moved on to new trends. After 2010, there was nothing. No announced games that got cancelled, no rumours of sequels that turned out to be hoaxes. Nothing. So long as you excuse Pro Skater HD and nobody liked it. But something doesn't quite add up. While skating games certainly didn't die due to any form of conspiracy, there's a couple of questions that come from its death. Like, why did Skate suddenly end? Why weren't there more successful skating games before Pro Skater? And why did Tony Hawk fail when so many other yearly installments of reality games are still around? After all, most of the games interpreting sports and real activities are only becoming more popular as time goes on. Titles like 2K and FIFA are consistently breaking new records despite going several years deep, and those games haven't changed at all. These titles don't have much room for experimentation, and yet they're still highly successful. Also, please close that door before this video ends up any longer than it already is. However, despite both sets of games being grounded in reality, these two aren't competing on the same level. What separates the perpetual success of FIFA to the fleeting appeal of skating games is cultural relevance. During and prior to the early 2000s, there was a point where you could consider skateboarding as mainstream. Pro Skater is likely the most impactful indication of that, but you can find skating involved in some way or another in a ton of media from around the time. In the 2000s, you've got OPM's Heaven is a Halfpipe, 2001, Sum 41's Fat Lip, 2002, Avril Lavigne's Skater Boy. While skateboarding was an activity independent of any particular lifestyle, it was particularly pronounced in the pop culture of this era. The thing is that came from the growing youth culture of the 80s and 90s. Skateboarding wasn't necessarily fading away, but the young adults who liked it the most were going down different life paths that made it fall out of their interest. The growing 2000s youth culture would start to have different interests, new things that caught their attention, ironically video games being one of them. By 2004, skating started to trail off in popularity as digital media rapidly morphed what was in the public consciousness. It was effectively a trend. A fad of an era, and like all trends do, they dissipate to be replaced by whatever comes next. After which point, a large portion of the casual consumer market stopped paying attention to games about the topic, irrespective of whether they were good or bad. Compare that with football, which, regardless of the game's quality, has massive cultural ties to most countries, and it doesn't matter how much people kick and scream about the quality of the content or how intrusive the monetization systems are, the install base will be ever present. On the other hand, Madden, which sells in the millions every year, is a game that I don't even know the quality of, because it has no cultural impact in England. It's not that Madden isn't a good game, it's that we have no interest in it culturally, and so it sees minuscule success. When Tony Hawk as a series went from game to game on a yearly basis, its success was, in part, thanks to skateboarding's cultural relevance, regardless of the game's quality. You can see further evidence of this reflected in many of the failed sports games. Golf had a brief stint with yearly installments, but especially as bad press started to surround frontrunner Tiger Woods, the popularity of the sport started stagnating, and the PGA games became less frequent and less successful. The NHL is still getting games, but I'm going to assume that was news to you the same way that it was shocking news to me. Games advertising themselves in reality just don't sell based on quality, and if Pro Skater had continued, we would have seen an even more direct reflection of this. As Tony Hawk kept going, it didn't really matter how strong the games were. Tony Hawk kicked the bucket extra early with consistently poor experiences, but it would only live as long as skating was still in the spotlight. But if that's the case, why weren't there more successful skating games before Tony Hawk? Well, there were. Remember this? 2 Extreme? One of the throwaway titles right at the start of the PlayStation? This title sold 1 million copies and was the 109th most purchased game on the PlayStation 1. It might not be remembered well, but being remembered is a reflection of artistic quality, not the kind of financial success that matters when it comes to making a series. Many of the games that released were successful enough to keep their studios going, they just weren't the smash successes that get remembered almost 30 years after their inception. Now, 2 Extreme never hit the heights of Pro Skater because of its lack of quality, but the premise alone was enough to push boxes out of stores. Pro Skater's meteoric dominance over a market is thanks to its quality, but that doesn't mean that there weren't other successful games prior to Pro Skater. It's just that this game was so influential, other games without the same impact are lost to time. So all that remains is wondering why we haven't gotten Skate 4. We can point at the fading relevance of skating, but it wasn't gone. Skate 3's sales figures show that there was at least enough interest in the topic to justify making a game, but we have yet to see the next entries in the series. Thanks to the fact that there's not exactly much investigative journalism in Skate of all games, we're gonna have to speculate heavily here. But I think that it might have been an issue more related to the studio and publisher than demand. First of all, where do you take Skate? This isn't exactly a game with a lot to develop on. You've got almost every trick you could possibly imagine and a robust build-your-own-park system, so new maps would feel redundant. Without completely changing the type of game that Skate is, you just don't have room to experiment, which would put your already falling review score at even more risk. This is wrong, by the way. Here's a real set of review scores. Fuck out of here with that bullshit! From the developer's perspective, it wasn't worth making another title so soon. All making another game would do is turn this into a yearly installment that doesn't have enough new ideas to justify its own existence. From the publisher's perspective, EA might have also seen the state that Tony Hawk ended up in and decided to not oversaturate the market in order to retain and capitalize on interest a couple of years down the line. Or maybe it was slightly more insidious. The majority of the games that EA published during the rest of that console generation were microtransaction-heavy titles that were consistently safe bets. EA was at the point where the monetization of games beyond their release was one of its top priorities after the success of Ultimate Team packs in FIFA 11. Even the more experimental titles, like a Dead Space sequel, was laced with microtransactions, and when more conventional monetization structures found in the likes of the 2012 SSX reboot wasn't considered enough after it sold a combined total of 1.5 million copies, maybe it was a good thing that Skate went when it did. Unfortunately, what filled the void that skating games left was mobile shovelware, and maybe there's a diamond in the rough out there somewhere, but we would have found it by now if it was worth talking about. That didn't mean that there weren't people who desperately wanted a new skateboarding game, but without anything on the horizon, that population was getting smaller by the day. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, in 2015, Pro Skater 5 released, and it bombed. It sold poorly, reviewed poorly, and it's not even worth talking about. It's the worst parts of every game that came before it, repeated ad nauseum, with the best bits left as a poor imitation of their former glory. Like the worst of Tony Hawk's previous entries, it's not abysmal, it's boring. Maybe it was a cash grab, maybe it was incompetence, but whatever caused the game to be the game that it was, that didn't matter. It left everyone dissatisfied, to the point where even lingering interest in any skateboarding game disappeared in an instant. After years of incredible games, there was nothing left. No interest in the genre, nothing on the horizon. Skating games were well and truly dead. It would seem the tale had come to an end, and to an extent, it has. It's been 10 years since a major AAA title had been regarded well, and even longer since one was at the top of the market. It doesn't seem like Blizzard and Ubisoft are foaming at the mouth to make a live service around half-pipes. And the gaming market has changed so much since the heights of the early 2000s that I realistically can't see a way of getting back, unless we get like Tony Hawk's Battle for Gacha. However, due to the rise in independent development, I think we might be at the precipice of a new, quieter generation of games. What's happening now is many developers who grew up playing Skate, Tony Hawk, or just love skateboarding are now gaining access to engines like Unity and Unreal that allow them to continue where the genre left off. Some are attempting to fill the void of Skate, like 2022's Session or 2020's Skater XL. Looking at Skate more from the angle of a simulator, they take your relationship with your board to its logical extreme. You have a new twin stick system by which you literally control both feet, making even the simplest tricks a bit of a challenge. While this will definitely alienate people not willing to put the time in to learn this extremely complicated control scheme, it might be the niche that satisfies those who wanted skate to ride even closer to reality. Others are taking inspiration more from the Pro Skater franchise with 2021's Skatebird, which is admittedly a little too ambitious for the game that it is, or 2021's The Ramp, which is less of a game and more of an extremely polished micro toy about vert skating, which can be compared handedly to the GBA Tony Hawk titles. On the flip side, you've got games like Ollie Ollie, which has actually been going since 2014 and just this year had another much better installment, acting like an amalgamation of Skate's trick system with a bit trip runner type experience to make something extremely fresh. I doubt any of these games are going to set the world on fire, however they show that there is at least interest out there somewhere in making new skating experiences. And while not very vocal, there's certainly an audience out there who are still hungry for these games. Just look at Thug Pro, a mod for Thug 2 for score chasers and people that just want to play multiplayer that's still supported to this day and has hundreds of mods keeping an ancient title alive. In the Tony Hawk franchise especially, I still feel like there was something that never fully got tapped into. And with new games in the future, I'm holding out hope that a developer can come along and finally realize that potential. I'm looking for a new AirBlade is what I'm saying. Criterion, hire this man. This man being me. I'll make a new one, fuck it. You know, Pro Skater 1+2 came out in 2020 and, well, Pro Skater 5 was such a flop that I just ignored it. With this video coming up though, I had to play it and it's incredible. People love it, especially me. It's still gripping, but I don't just want to sit there and relive the past. I want to see what's next, and guessing by how well this game sold, I would like to think that there's a lot of people out there that are a lot like me. A lot of these games are incredibly recent developments, which gives me hope that this isn't just another false alarm and is actually the start of people building on the groundwork of games that are now double digits years old. Rollerdrome comes out in August, and that's taking heavy inspiration from Pro Skater, and Bomb Rush Cyberfunk is on the way, which is probably going to be closer to Jet Set Radio, but it has a skateboard, so I'm still hype anyway. Team Reptile, please, I've been poisoned, and the only cure is you giving me Bomb Rush Cyberfunk today. Based on the 2 years' recent accumulation of games, we might just be at the dawn Skate looked like it was going to be. And even if they aren't really skating games, they at least carry the soul that the briefly existing genre had. We will probably never have the genre resurrect to the point of its 2000s mania, and my nostalgia for a childhood means that I'll miss that moment in time dearly. But I mean, there's stuff to look forward to. And there was so much life in these games that unless one day Pro Skater and every idea it ever spawned suddenly disappears from history and my hard drive, even if the genre's dead, I won't consider them dead games.